The last thing anyone remembered about Princess Iravel was the sound. Not her face, though portraits still hung in the long galleries of the Vale Citadel, dust collecting on the gilded frames. Not her name, though scribes had once scratched it into the foundation stones of 7 alliance treaties. What people remembered, when they remembered anything at all, was the sound she made when the Vashriel took her, a single sustained note, half scream and half song, that rose through the smoke of the burning courtyard and then simply stopped, as if something had swallowed it whole. That was 11 years ago. The kingdom had been in the middle of a war it did not expect to win, and then somehow did, and the victory was so costly and so strange that the survivors spent the better part of a decade trying to understand what had happened. Princess Iravel was not the only one who had disappeared. Thousands were taken that way in the first months of the Vashriel incursion, lifted into the pale ships while still alive, mouths open, the sound cut clean. But she was the only one who had mattered in the way royalty always matters. As a symbol, as a story, as a kind of gravity around which a people could organize their grief. The kingdom forgot her the way kingdoms always forget. Slowly, then completely, then with mild embarrassment when reminded. So when the signal came from the eastern marshlands at the beginning of the dry season, it found a people who had moved on. It found soldiers reassigned to peacetime posts. It found diplomats negotiating trade agreements with the very species that had once tried to eat their world. It found a young engineer named Castle working a night shift in a signals relay station, 300 kilometers from anyone who might care what he was doing, alone in a room full of instruments that hummed in frequencies he had spent 5 years learning to read. Castle heard it first as interference, a distortion in the lower band, rhythmic and faintly melodic, the kind of pattern that human ears are specifically wired to find in noise. He pushed his headset tighter and leaned forward in his chair, and for a moment he thought he was imagining it because the pattern wasn't random. It had structure. It had breath. He had been waiting 11 years for something exactly like this. He was 28 years old. He had been 17 when the Vashriel came. He had been stationed at the Vale Citadel as a technical apprentice, 3rd tier, responsible for maintaining the harmonic resonance towers that protected the palace complex from long-range psychic interference. He had been good at his job in the way certain people are good at jobs that require them to listen very carefully to things other people cannot hear. He had also been, in the way that 17-year-olds sometimes are, desperately and hopelessly devoted to someone completely unreachable. He had never spoken to Princess Iravel. He had seen her exactly 4 times, twice in formal procession, once across a courtyard when she had dropped something and bent to retrieve it, and for 3 seconds looked directly at him without registering his existence, and once on the night she was taken. That last time he had been 20 meters away, running toward the resonance towers when the sky opened and the pale ships descended, and she had been standing in the center of the courtyard in full ceremonial dress, because it had been the anniversary of the first accord and there had been a concert, and she had been performing. That was the part no one talked about in the official histories, that she had been performing when they took her, that she was the one playing. Iravel had been gifted with what the old scholars called psychic harmonics, the ability to generate frequencies through voice and body that resonated directly with the quantum lattice architecture that the Vashriel used as both weapon and nervous system. The Citadel had classified this as a minor talent, useful for treaty ceremonies and nothing else. The Vashriel had classified it as something worth crossing 30 light years to acquire. Castle had known this. He had been the one maintaining the resonance towers. He had watched the readings on the night of the anniversary concert and understood, in the 45 seconds between the sky opening and the pale ships descending, exactly what was happening and exactly why. He had also been 20 meters away and 17 years old, and there had been nothing he could do. He had spent 11 years doing the thing that people do when they carry guilt they cannot discharge. He had made himself useful. He had studied everything. Signal theory, Vosrel lattice architecture, the quantum mechanics of psychic resonance, the 16 known frequencies that the alien species used for communication, navigation, weaponization, and the 3 or 4 theoretical ones that no human had ever successfully identified. He had built a career out of listening. He had taken a posting at the most remote signals relay station in the eastern sector. Specifically, because the electromagnetic environment there was clean and quiet, and he could run experiments that would have raised uncomfortable questions if conducted anywhere near a population center. The experiments were simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. He was trying to build something that could send a signal into Vosrel space and receive a reply. Not a weapon, not a tracking device, a call. He had almost given up 3 months ago. The mathematics kept resolving to the same dead end. The carrier frequency he needed existed just outside the range of any instrument he could build with available materials. He'd been running variations on the same failed approach for 2 years. He'd started to think the whole thing was a grief project dressed up in engineering clothing, which was probably true, which did not make the mathematics any less real. Then he'd made a mistake. He'd been tired, and he'd crossed 2 input lines that should not have been crossed, and the result was not the usual flat nothing but a brief cascade of structured interference in exactly the lower band he'd been trying to reach. It had lasted 11 seconds. He had nearly fallen out of his chair. He had spent 6 weeks reverse engineering the mistake into something reproducible, and then he had turned it on and left it running and waited. That was the signal now singing through his headset. He sat very still and listened. It was not structured the way Vosrel signals were structured. He knew their patterns well enough by now to recognize the difference between their carrier waves and something riding inside them. This was riding inside. This was something nested in the lattice, something that had been waiting for a frequency that matched, and his device, his beautiful accidental device, had provided a match close enough to wake it up. He thought she is alive. He thought she has been trying to reach someone for 11 years. He thought nobody has been listening. He pressed record and let the signal run, and did not breathe for a long time. The Eastern Sector Regional Command had a duty officer named Sergeant Maeve Drellock, who was 43 years old, and had survived the Vosrel incursion by being extremely difficult to kill and extremely unwilling to follow orders she considered stupid. She had 3 decorations for valor that she kept in a box under her bunk, because she found the idea of wearing them embarrassing. She had the kind of institutional memory that organizations accumulate and then fail to consult, which is why she was still a sergeant at 43, and also why she was the most valuable person in the building. Castle called her at 3:40 because she was the only one he trusted to understand what he was saying. "Say that again," she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has been woken from deep sleep and is deciding whether to be annoyed or alarmed. "I'm receiving a structured signal in the Vosrel lower band. It's been running for 6 hours. It is not a Vosrel signal. It is something encoded inside their carrier wave that has the signature of human psychic harmonics." A pause. He heard her sit up. "You're telling me you found a person inside the Vosrel lattice?" "I'm telling you I found a signal that is consistent with human psychic harmonic encoding. Yes." "The princess?" "The mathematics suggest." "Castle," her voice was not flat anymore. It was something else. "Are you telling me the princess is alive?" He looked at the readings. The signal was still running, still structured, still breathing in the way that signals with human origin breathed, with the irregular rhythmic variation that no machine and no alien species had ever successfully replicated, because it came from a living nervous system. "I'm telling you the signal suggests a living human source." "Yes." Another pause, longer. "How long do you need to triangulate a position?" "I've already started. I need another 4 hours, maybe 6. "I'll be there in 2. She arrived in 90 minutes. She had driven herself through the dark in a military transport with no lights on, which was either impressive or terrifying depending on how you thought about it. She stood behind Castle's chair in the dim green glow of the instruments and listened through the secondary headset and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "That's not random." "No. That has structure." "Yes. That sounds like," she stopped, started again. "I heard her play once, at the fourth accord ceremony. I was there for security detail. She played for maybe 20 minutes and the sound went inside you, not like music, like something rearranging things." She paused. "That sounds like that." Castle nodded. He had been trying not to think about that, because thinking about it made his hands shake, and he needed his hands steady. "Who have you told?" Maeve asked. "You're the first." "Good." She pulled a chair over and sat down. "Let's figure out where she is before we tell anyone else. Because the moment we tell anyone else, this stops being a signals anomaly and starts being a political event, and political events have a way of getting people killed." He looked at her. She was staring at the instruments with an expression he recognized as the one people wore when they were doing calculations that involved someone's survival. "You think they'll try to stop a retrieval?" "I think it's been 11 years, Maeve said carefully. "I think there are people in that citadel who have built careers on the assumption that she's dead, treaties signed, succession lines drawn, power distributed in specific ways, and I think that when you tell them she's alive, you are not giving them good news. You are giving them a problem." The instruments hummed, the signal breathed. "Then we go get her first," Castle said. Maeve looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "You know this is likely to end badly." "Yes." "You know we're talking about going into Vashriel-held territory with, what exactly? 2 people and a signals relay station." "I've been running models for 3 years," Castle said. "I know the lattice architecture, I know the resonance patterns, I know what frequency would destabilize a mid-tier containment field. I know," he stopped, started again more quietly. "I know how to get one person out, maybe, if everything goes right." "Things rarely go right." "No." She nodded. She picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "I'll get us transport," she said, "and weapons, and 2 people I trust. That's all I can do without triggering questions." "That's enough." She stood. "Get me coordinates." He got her coordinates. The signal led them to a place called the Brackwater Shelf, which was a 40-kilometer stretch of submerged rock formation in the eastern marshes, where the Vashriel had, during the last phase of the incursion, established what the tactical reports described as a processing installation. The reports had not been specific about what was being processed. Castle had read the reports 11 years ago and understood immediately, and had filed this understanding in the same place he filed other things he could not act on, carefully, where it would not consume him. The installation was partially demolished. This was the result of a Citadel airstrike in the final months of the war, which had collapsed 3 of the 4 main structures and flooded the lower levels. What remained was a single spire rising out of the marsh water, 30 meters tall, made of the pale crystalline material the Vashriel grew rather than built. At the top of the spire, if you knew what to look for, there was a resonance array, a cluster of frequency emitters that were still powered, still running, still humming on the lower band, still transmitting a signal. They came by boat at night, moving without lights through channels that Maeve's 2 contacts, a woman named Ferris who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during the incursion, and a man named Coral who had simply never left the eastern sector after the war ended, and had built a life in the marshes that nobody official knew about, navigated by memory and touch. Castle sat in the bow with his portable receiver and watched the needle and said nothing. Maeve sat beside him and cleaned her sidearm in the dark, working by feel. "How does this work?" she said quietly. "Once we're there, what are we actually doing?" "The signal is encoded in the carrier wave," Castle said, "which means whatever is generating it is inside the lattice. Not just broadcasting from the installation. The source is embedded in the Voshrill frequency architecture. To pull it out, you need to introduce a counter-resonance that disrupts the embedding without destroying the signal itself." "In words I understand. I built a device that can play the carrier frequency in reverse. If I can get it close enough to the array and run it for long enough, it should unwrap the embedding and allow the source to separate." "Separate?" Maeve said this carefully. "The Voshrill don't take bodies," Castle said. "They take patterns, neurological architecture, what they call the resonance template. The body," he started again. "The body survives the extraction. It goes into a kind of deep stasis. If the template is correctly re-embedded, the body should wake up." "Should?" "Yes. You've tested this." "On the mathematical models, extensively. On actual living things." A pause. "On one occasion, a marsh bird that had been partially extracted 3 years ago." He did not elaborate on how he had found a partially extracted marsh bird or what it had taken to bring it back. The point was that it had worked. Maeve absorbed this. "And the body that's been in stasis for 11 years, what condition is it in?" "The Voshrill lattice preserves biological material extremely effectively. It is, among other things, one of the most sophisticated life support systems in the known galaxy. If the pattern is still broadcasting," he glanced at the receiver. The needle held steady. "The body is intact." "Injured though? You said injured." "The signal has markers, things you can read in psychic harmonic encoding if you know what to look for. There are frequencies in there that correspond to physical trauma responses. Old ones, healed over mostly, but the record is there." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "She's been conscious in there 11 years. "Not exactly conscious, not exactly unconscious. The Voshrill extraction process puts the host in a state that doesn't have a human analog. She would have been," he paused, searching for the right word. "Dreaming, maybe, a very long dream, with enough lucidity to maintain the signal. Which is..." "Which is what?" He looked at the needle again. "Which is extraordinary," he said. 11 years of maintaining a signal in a foreign substrate, waiting for someone with the right receiver, without knowing if anyone was listening, without knowing if anyone would come." He paused. "That takes something I'm not sure I have a name for." The boat moved through dark water. Ahead, barely visible against the sky, the pale spire rose. The installation was not unguarded. This was the thing Castle had been careful not to think about too directly during the planning phase, because thinking about it too directly would have made the whole enterprise feel impossible, which would have been accurate but unhelpful. The Voshrill had withdrawn from human space after the war ended. This was a matter of historical fact, confirmed by the Veil Accords and 11 years of subsequent non-aggression. What was less widely known, what Castle knew from 3 years of signals work and Maeve knew from a different and more violent kind of experience, was that withdrawn did not mean gone. It meant operating at a different frequency. There were still nodes, still installations. Most were dormant, running on automation, but dormant was not the same as empty. Ferris and Coral left the boat 200 meters out and entered the water, moving toward the spire's base with the slow patience of people who had spent years in these marshes. They were not soldiers in the formal sense. They were something older and harder than that, people who had been fighting this particular war since before it officially started, and had never fully received the notification that it was over. They went first to do the thing that needed to be done before Castle could do the thing that only he could do. Maeve and Castle waited in the boat. He checked his device for the 14th time. It was a small thing, barely larger than a standard relay unit, built from salvaged components and 2 years of obsessive refinement. It was the kind of object that looked like nothing to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. It looked like something you'd find in a repair kit or in the junk drawer of a signals relay station. It was, if the mathematics were correct, capable of reaching into an alien dimensional substrate and pulling out a human soul. He tried not to think about it that way. He had been trying not to think about it that way for 3 years. "You've been carrying this since the war," Maeve said, not looking at him. "Yes. The guilt, I mean, not the device." He considered denying it, decided not to. "Yes. I want you to understand something," she said. She was still looking at the spire. "What happened that night you were 17? You were a third-tier apprentice. There was nothing you could have done. I knew the frequency. You knew the theory, that's different. I knew they would come for her. I had seen the readings. I understood." "Castle." She turned and looked at him in the dark, and her face was the face of someone who had spent 43 years in a world that did not clean its wounds easily. "You were 17. You can spend your whole life building a device that will make it right, or you can understand that it was never yours to make right. Both things can be true at the same time." He thought about that. The marsh was quiet. Somewhere ahead, Ferris and Coral were moving through cold water in the dark, doing something dangerous and necessary with extreme competence and no acknowledgement. "I know," he said, "but I still want to get her out." "Good," Maeve said, "because that's a better reason than guilt. That's just wanting someone back." They heard a faint sound from the spire's base. A signal from Ferris, 3 short taps on the hull of the boat. "Ready." They moved. The interior of the spire was lit by the bioluminescence native to Vashral crystal, a pale blue-green glow that turned everything the color of deep water. Castle had been in Vashral installations before, twice, during the final cleanup phase of the war, and he had the same feeling now that he'd had then, that the architecture was not designed for beings that moved through space the way humans moved through space. The angles were wrong. The proportions were wrong. The surfaces curved in directions that his eyes kept trying to resolve into familiar geometries and couldn't. Ferris and Coral had cleared the base level. 2 Vashral maintenance drones, automated, not sentient, lay disassembled in the corner with the particular thoroughness of people who knew what they were doing. Castle did not ask about this. He went directly to the central column. The resonance array was at the top. He couldn't reach it directly from here. What he could reach was the root of the lattice, the grounding point where the installation's frequency architecture connected to the planetary substrate. From here, the carrier wave was most accessible. From here, the counter-resonance would travel most efficiently. He set the device on the floor and powered it on. It made no sound. It was not designed to make sound. What it was designed to make was something in the lower band below human hearing, a frequency that the Vashral lattice would interpret as an inversion of its own carrier wave, not an attack, because an attack would trigger responses he could not handle with 4 people and a portable device. Something more subtle, a question in the lattice's own language, a key that would turn the lock the right direction. He connected the leads to the grounding node. The device's display lit with a reading he had been waiting 3 years to see. The signal was here, stronger than it had been at the relay station, much stronger. He could read the structure of it in the display, and it was unmistakably, heartbreakingly human. The irregular rhythms, the harmonic complexity, the specific frequencies that a human nervous system in a specific state of extended preservation would generate. The markers he had described to Maeve were there. The old injury signatures, healed. And something else, something he hadn't been able to read clearly at 300 kilometers distance but could read clearly now. She had been awake. Not dreaming. Awake. In the Vashral substrate, in whatever condition it was possible to be awake inside a dimensional lattice, she had been awake. She had been listening. She had been maintaining the signal not because of some automated biological process, but deliberately, consciously, because she understood that a signal was the only way out, and she had refused to stop sending it even when 11 years of silence could have justified stopping. He thought of the note he had heard that night, half scream, half song. He had always thought of it as the sound of someone being taken. He understood now that it had also been the sound of someone refusing to go quietly. He pressed the activation sequence. The device began to run. It did not do anything dramatic. There was no light, no sound, no visible effect on the installation. The Vashra lattice continued its low hum. The pale crystal walls continued their soft glow. Maeve and Ferris and Coral held their positions and watched the doors and said nothing. Castle watched the display. The counter-resonance was traveling through the grounding structure. He could track it in the readings, a slow unwinding, frequency by frequency, like pulling a braid apart at the bottom. The carrier wave was enormous and ancient, and he was unwrapping a single thread of it, trying to be precise enough not to disturb the rest. Too much disturbance and the automated defense architecture would wake up. Too little and the embedding would not release. 7 minutes. 8. The numbers on the display moved in directions he had predicted, which was reassuring, and in a few directions he had not predicted, which was not. He made adjustments. The device's mathematics were his mathematics. He had built it. He understood every decision he had made in building it, and he was not adjusting blindly. He was adjusting the way you adjust something you have made with your hands and understand from the inside. Maeve appeared beside him. How long? I don't know, maybe 10 more minutes, maybe 20. Ferris says she's hearing something at the perimeter. He looked up. What kind of something? The kind that has mass. He looked at the display. The unwinding was going well. It was going, in fact, better than he had modeled, which was the first good luck he had experienced tonight. 15 minutes minimum, he said. Probably, if nothing goes wrong with the unwinding. 15 minutes. I can't rush it. If I rush it, and the separation is incomplete. I know. She put her hand on his shoulder for a moment, brief, definite, and then moved back toward the door. He heard her say something quiet to Ferris and Coral. He did not turn to look. He focused on the display. The frequency was unwinding, thread by thread. The carrier wave was enormous, and the embedded signal was a single harmonic inside it, and he was very carefully peeling them apart. He found himself holding his breath and made himself breathe regularly because his hands needed to be steady. 9 minutes in, the display changed. The embedded signal separated from the carrier wave. For a moment, it just floated there, if floating was the right word for something that existed in frequency space. It was complete, intact, unmistakably human, unmistakably alive. 11 years of patient waiting. 11 years of maintaining a signal in a hostile substrate on the chance that someone would eventually build the right receiver. He looked at it on the display and could not think of anything that would adequately describe what it meant that this was real, that the mathematics had been right, that she was here. He ran the second sequence. The re-embedding protocol, back into biology, back into a nervous system that had been waiting in crystal stasis for 11 years. From somewhere above them in the body of the spire, something changed, a harmonic shift, a crystal tone that rose and then fell. Then silence. Then from a chamber he hadn't known was there, a door opened in the wall. She was on the floor of the chamber when they found her, and she was not the princess of the portraits. She was a woman in her late 20s, thin in the way that 11 years in stasis makes you thin, preserved but not nourished, maintained but not sustained. Her eyes were open. The light in them was immediate and present, and absolutely not the eyes of someone who had been sleeping. She looked at Castle, and he had the disorienting experience of being seen clearly by someone he had only ever watched from a distance. "You found me," she said. Her voice was rough with disuse. The Vashra lattice did not, it turned out, maintain the vocal cords the way it maintained everything else. "Yes." "How long?" 11 years. She absorbed this without visible shock, which was either because she had calculated it herself inside the lattice, or because she was beyond the scale of shock that 11 years produced. Is the war over? Yes, we won mostly. Mostly. There were accords. Her expression shifted. He could not read the shift precisely, but it had something to do with what she already knew and what she had been expecting to hear. They let the installation stand. Some, the active ones, were demolished. The dormant ones, he paused. This was not the conversation to be having on the floor of a Vashral spire with something at the perimeter. We need to move. She tried to sit up. He helped her. Her hand on his arm was cold, stasis cold. And when she stood the way you stand when your legs have theoretically been maintained by alien crystal for 11 years, and you are now discovering that theory and practice are somewhat different. She held his arm and did not fall. She was, he thought, the most specifically stubborn person he had ever encountered, and he had met her approximately 30 seconds ago. I can hear them, she said. Hear who? The Vashral, at the perimeter. She looked at the walls of the chamber, at the crystal, at the faint bioluminescence, with an expression that was not fear but something adjacent to it, the expression of someone who knows a place very well and does not like it. They'll know the lattice has been disrupted. They'll have already sent. Maeve, Castle said it toward the door. Working on it. Maeve's voice from the outer chamber was absolutely calm, which was either reassuring or alarming depending on how well you knew her. The sound of Ferris and Coral doing something efficient followed immediately. Iravel, the princess, the woman, the signal he had been chasing for 3 years, looked at him. Her grip on his arm had strengthened as she found her balance. Who are you? She said. Castle, I was a signals apprentice at the Vale Citadel. That's where I was taken from. Yes, I was there, yes. She studied him for a moment with the particular attention of someone whose long isolation had sharpened, rather than dulled their ability to read people. You came alone, mostly alone. Without official authorization. Yes. Why? It was a simple question. He had a complicated answer and they had no time for it. Because I built a receiver that could hear you, and once I could hear you it seemed wrong not to come. She held his gaze for another second. Then she nodded once, which was the most efficient expression of trust he had ever witnessed. Then let's go, she said. The Vashral at the perimeter were 3. This was more than Castle had hoped for and fewer than his worst estimates, which was the kind of information that could mean anything depending on why there were exactly 3. He understood why when they reached the outer door, and he got his first look at them. They were not soldiers. They were, he searched for the right word and found it in his signal work, archivists. The Vashral had a caste of beings responsible for maintaining the dormant installations, and they looked different from the soldier caste that had prosecuted the war. Smaller, more elongated, with the specific physical attentiveness of creatures whose job involved careful listening. They were armed because the Vashral armed everyone, but they were armed the way you arm someone whose job is records management rather than combat. They had also stopped moving, all 3 of them, standing at the perimeter of the landing platform in the pale pre-dawn light, not advancing, not retreating, watching. Watching Iravel. She had come through the outer door supporting herself on Castle's arm, and when she and the 3 Vashral archivists looked at each other, there was a long moment of something that Castle could not read but Maeve clearly could, because she did not raise her weapon. Iravel said something, not in any language Castle recognized, in something that was not exactly language, something that lived in the lower frequency range, something that resonated in the crystal of the spire behind them. The 3 archivists' physical posture shifted in unison. What are you saying? Castle said quietly. Telling them the archive is closed, she said. Her voice had something different in it now. Something that came from 11 years inside their lattice, inside their frequency architecture. something that had perhaps gone in one direction but also traveled in another, telling them this record has been retrieved by its origin, that their obligation of maintenance is complete. The three archivists looked at each other. Then, one by one, they stepped aside. "The Voshril have a concept," Irevel said, moving forward, "that does not translate well. Something like the data returns to the source and the source has priority. I spent 11 years learning their frequency architecture. I learned things inside that lattice that they did not expect me to learn." She walked across the platform and none of the archivists moved to stop her, including that. Coral had the boat ready. They went down into the marsh. The boat moved through the dark before dawn, and for a while no one spoke. Irevel sat in the stern with a thermal wrap that Ferris had produced from somewhere, and a mug of something hot that Coral had handed to her without ceremony or sentiment, and she held the mug in both hands and looked at the water. Castle sat across from her and tried not to stare. She caught him anyway. "Ask," she said. "What?" "Whatever you've been trying to figure out how to ask since you found me." He considered several options and picked the honest one. How much of it was deliberate, the signal? "All of it," she said, "from the first week." "The first week? After they extracted me." She said it without flinching, the way you say things you have had 11 years to come to terms with. "I spent the first several days, I don't know exactly how long, time in the lattice is not linear, understanding what had happened to me, what they had done and why. And then I spent the next period learning the architecture, not because I planned to escape through it, because it was the only thing to do. The alternative was," she paused, "the alternative was to stop. To stop sending the signal. To stop believing anyone would hear it." She looked at him over the mug. "I kept modifying it, kept finding better frequencies, closer to the surface of the carrier wave, kept making it louder in the ways I understood how to make it louder." 11 years. Her voice did not waver. It was simply a statement of fact about a quantity of time that contained an extraordinary quantity of will. "I did not know if anyone was building a receiver. I did not know if the mathematics existed. I did not know if humans had any understanding of the Voshril lattice architecture. I knew that I understood it, and I knew that if I kept the signal structured correctly, the right receiver could find it." She paused. "I chose to believe the receiver would exist." Castle looked at his hands. He thought about the 2 years of failure, the repeated dead ends, the crossed lines and the accidental breakthrough, and the 3 years of refinement. The moment of decision when the signal came through, and he had known, with a certainty that had nothing to do with professional risk assessment, that he was going. "It does exist," he said, "for what it's worth." "I know," she said. "I'm in a boat." Something in the air between them shifted. Ferris made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Maeve looked at the water with an expression of serene non-involvement. What came next was neither simple nor clean, which was what Maeve had predicted, and Castle had understood, and neither of them had fully prepared for. Because you cannot fully prepare for things that are political in the specific way that the return of a dead princess is political. Irevel was not dead. This was, as Maeve had anticipated, a problem for certain people. It was not a problem that could be solved with weapons or signals theory. It was a problem that required a different kind of expertise, and Irevel turned out to have spent 11 years developing a great deal of it. The meetings happened in a conference room in the regional command building, because Irevel refused to go to the Citadel until she understood the current configuration of power within it. And she understood the current configuration of power within it after approximately 4 hours of intensive briefing from Maeve. Castle sat in the corner of these briefings and listened and watched Irevel process information with the specific efficiency of someone who had spent 11 years with nothing to do but think. He had known, intellectually, that she was not the girl from the portraits. He had known, intellectually, that 11 years in a Voshril lattice would produce something different from the ceremonial princess of the first Accord anniversaries. He had not known what that different thing would look like. until he watched her sit across from people 3 times her rank who were very carefully trying to determine whether she was a problem, and saw her determine, within approximately 4 minutes of each conversation, exactly what they were afraid of and why. She was also, in the direct way that people are sometimes direct when they have been alone for a very long time, interested in why Castle had come for her. They talked in the margins of the political negotiations, in the corridors, and once on a roof where the view was the eastern marsh, and the first autumn stars were coming on. She asked about the signal's work. He explained it carefully and completely, the way he explained things to people he respected, and she listened and asked the right questions and asked a few questions he had not expected, because she had, it turned out, a working understanding of Voshril lattice architecture that exceeded his by a significant margin. "The crossed lines," she said on the third evening. "The mistake I made that broke the dead end." "It wasn't a mistake," she said. "I modified the signal 2 years ago to include a specific frequency bridge that would create exactly that cascade if it entered a receiver with a sufficient base architecture. I had been watching the signal interact with the planet's electromagnetic substrate for years. I knew there were human receivers out there. I narrowed the approach." She paused. "I didn't know if anyone had the right base architecture, but you did." He stared at her. "You caused the breakthrough. You built the receiver. I gave you what you needed to complete it." She looked at the stars. "We found each other from opposite ends." He thought about this for a long time. He thought about the 17-year-old who had stood frozen in a courtyard while the sky opened. He thought about the 11 years of trying to do something about something he had not caused and could not have prevented and had felt responsible for anyway. He thought about what Maeve had said in the boat, about wanting someone back being a better reason than guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, "for taking so long." She looked at him, not with the measuring look she used for negotiations, and not with the specific attention she brought to signals analysis. "Something different. You built a receiver from scratch and pointed it at a dimensional substrate that human science barely understands," she said. "And you drove out to a partially demolished Voshril installation in the middle of a marsh at 3 in the morning with a sergeant, a woman with 3 fingers, and a man who lives in the water." She paused. "I don't think 11 years of that is best described as taking too long." 4 months, he said. "What?" "From the breakthrough to the signal, that was 4 months." "Then you were fast." She almost smiled. It was the first time he had seen her almost smile, and it did something to the temperature of the evening. "Don't apologize for being fast." The political situation resolved itself over 6 weeks, in the way political situations resolve when the person at the center of them has 11 years of accumulated patience and a thorough understanding of what everyone in the room is afraid of. The accords were not appended. The succession questions were addressed in ways that were complicated and not entirely satisfying to anyone but sustainable, which is the most you can ask of political settlements. The Citadel's institutional embarrassment was managed. Several people who had been comfortable with the assumption of Iravel's death found themselves in the discomforting position of having to pretend they had not been comfortable with it. Maeve received a promotion she didn't want and accepted it anyway because it came with a budget. Ferris and Coral were recognized in a ceremony they attended in their marsh clothes and declined to change out of. Castle was offered a position at the Citadel's Signals Research Division, which was a significant professional advancement and also meant relocating from the Eastern Sector Relay Station, which was a small and specific grief. He stood in the Signals Relay Station on the last morning and looked at the instruments and thought about everything he had built there. The years of failure, the crossed lines, the morning the needle moved. Iravel came to the station that last morning, which he had not expected. She came alone, which he had also not expected. She stood in the doorway of the relay room and looked at the instruments with the expression of someone acknowledging a place that matters. "You could have stayed here," she said. After the citadel, after the settlement. I know. Why didn't you? He thought about it. The honest answer was simple and also complicated, and he was getting better at saying the simple version. Because I spent 11 years building something in the hope that you were out there. And then you were, and I would like to find out what that leads to. She was quiet for a moment. The instruments hummed in their low frequencies, the particular sound of the eastern marshes in the electromagnetic register, a sound he had heard for 5 years and would not hear again after today. I spent 11 years sending a signal in the hope that someone out there had the right receiver, she said. And then you did, she paused. I'm also interested in what that leads to. The morning light came through the single eastern window and touched the instruments and touched her face, and Castle thought, this is what it looks like when mathematics is correct. When you build a thing carefully enough and point it at the right frequency and are willing to wait. This is what comes back. He closed down the station, one instrument at a time. Later, years later, when the story had been written in the way that human beings write their important stories, incompletely, sentimentally, with crucial details misremembered and others inexplicably preserved, people would focus on the politics, the succession compromise, the renegotiation of the Eastern Accords, the way the kingdom had to reconfigure itself around a fact it had decided to do without. What the records did not fully capture was smaller. The boat in the dark water, the device on the floor of the crystal spire, the 3 Vashriel archivists stepping aside when a woman who had spent 11 years inside their architecture told them the record had been retrieved by its origin. The way a note had risen in a burning courtyard and been heard, eventually, by the right ears. It is not dramatic, the mechanics of how a person gets found. It is mostly dark water and careful mathematics, and someone who refuses, in the face of 11 years of silence, to stop sending the signal. It is, on the other side, someone who refuses to stop building the receiver. It is stubbornness and specificity, and the very human conviction that a pattern in the noise is a pattern that deserves to be read. The kingdom had forgotten her, that is true. But something about the way she had maintained that signal, 11 years, alone in an alien lattice, making it cleaner and louder and more precisely tuned as she learned the architecture that contained her, suggested that she had never quite forgotten herself. That is the thing the Vashriel had not accounted for, in their calculation that the human capacity for psychic harmonics was simply a resource to be harvested. They had taken her for her frequency. They had not anticipated that a human being placed inside a frequency architecture and given nothing to do but learn it would eventually understand it more completely than any instrument they had built to contain her. They had not anticipated 11 years of patient, stubborn, specific self-education by someone who had decided that the way out was through. They had taken a princess. They had, in a sense, educated a signal engineer who understood their own architecture from the inside. This is also not in the formal records. It appears in a set of technical papers that Iravel published through the Citadel's Signals Division in the years that followed, dense and precise, and largely incomprehensible to non-specialists. Castle understood them. He had, by that point, collaborated on 3 of them. The 4th paper, the one that outlined a complete theoretical framework for human navigation of Vashriel dimensional substrates, was co-authored and dedicated in a single line at the front. To Maeve, who drove without lights, and to Ferris and Coral, who knew the water. It is a small dedication. It is precisely accurate. The Vashriel read the papers. This is documented. What they made of them is not. What is documented is that the installation at the Brackwater Shelf, what remained of it after the war, the spire, the resonance array, was quietly dismantled in the year after the 4th paper appeared. The Vashriel sent no communication explaining this. They simply came and took the crystal down, piece by piece, and returned it to wherever they had grown it. The marsh went quiet. The electromagnetic readings in the eastern sector dropped to background noise. Castle, who still kept instruments at the window of the apartment they shared by that point, noted the change on the third day of autumn. He said nothing about it to Iravel. She was writing, at the desk she preferred, in the early morning light, with the particular quality of stillness she had when she was working, and he did not want to interrupt her. But she said without looking up, "It's gone." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. She kept writing. Outside the window, the eastern marshes ran all the way to the horizon, flat and silver in the autumn light, and the sky above them was clear and simple and empty of ships. That was enough.